Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We are still celebrating 10 years of Set Lusting Bruce, and as I'd shared, I was part of a really magical weekend at Monmouth University, and one of the connections I made was with my new friend Martin. So, Martin, great seeing you again, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jesse. It's great to be on the podcast and talking to your fans and to your followers.
Yeah, so why don't we start out? Tell us a little about yourself.
Okay, I'm a journalist and I've been writing about the audio world of audio for almost 50 years right now. Giving you some background, audio 50 years ago was the technology. If you were a kid and you were a tech bro in those days, you didn't have computers, you didn't have social media, certainly didn't have AI. What you had was your hi-fi, your stereo. And I was a stereo geek. And from becoming a stereo geek and listening to the records and really absorbing the liner notes and falling in love with places where and the obscure places and details, the people who recorded those records back in the early 70s and mid 70s. I started writing about it. I started a couple of magazines in the area. And then I decided maybe I could make a record and maybe I could learn how to make a record. So my parents got me into a place called 914 Studios, which is part of this legacy and part of the story, up in Blauvelt, New York, where I took some lessons and learned how to work the console, work the tape machines, and fell in love with it and merged that love for making of albums, the mystery of working in a recording studio, with my interest in writing and journalism. Started a couple of magazines, one called Pro Sound News, which was the trade magazine for recording studios in the late 70s, which was a heyday of recording studios. And went off and always had this dream to write a book about one of the most magical studios of the time, Record Plant. Because my work with the magazine Pro Sound News, I met a gentleman named Chris Stone. Chris Stone was the owner and one of the founders of that famous recording studio. And Chris would tell stories. Chris would just yak it up, and he'd party. He would tell stories that I couldn't believe it. And I'd say, Chris, you gotta let me write your book. You gotta let me write your book. And he said, no, the recording studio, you don't understand, Marty. Recording studios are private places. You don't tell the stories. You keep them, you take them to your grave.
Yeah.
And back in around 2016, he hooked me up with his PR guy, a longtime associate named David Goggin of his, and who was also a writer in the studio press at the time.
hmm
Gave us the go ahead and said, I'm telling the stories, and you guys can write the story about the record plant. And that's how it began.
I can't wait to dive into the book and to more. I have a lot of probably rookie questions about that magic of sound and recording. But I always like to start at the beginning. Martin, where did you grow up? And what kind of, you mentioned you were in love, you sound captivated you, but what kind of music were your parents listening to? And where do you think that love came from?
It was Gilbert and Sullivan, right? It was the old albums, listening to Gilbert and Sullivan on my parents' mono tape machine. But then, so it started there. It then got into the idea of you could, of a magical device called the tape machine came around. And I had a friend,
Now,
Larry.
I just want to make sure. Are we talking the rectangular cassette tape recorder?
No, you're talking about reel to reel,
Oh, okay.
old school. And I had a friend Larry who had got one of these tape machines, and with his brother Jack, and
Okay.
they would record stuff. They would off the radio. We would record off albums, and we would share albums. This is back in the reel to reel days, and I
Okay.
just fell in love with that device. I just fell in love with that device. So taking my parents' love for listening to show tunes and operettas to rock and roll. And my early days where I fell in love with Cream, The Doors, Jimi
Okay.
Hendrix, but it was all about Hendrix for me in those days. And again, Hendrix brought me back to Record Plant and constantly saying, where is this? I'd look at the back of those album covers and read about this place called Record Plant, and it added to the mystery of what was this place where Electric Ladyland was recorded. And got lucky enough years later to write the book
One
and
of the
tell.
things, yeah, one of the things, Martin, I probably irritate people asking, but I'm fascinated. Have you given any thought on why you were captivated? What about that magic spoke to you?
I'll tell you, sound is a very interesting function.
Yeah.
It appeals, and sound and music are basically the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Why do people love music? Do you love music because you love the lyrics? But lyrics are make sounds, all right? They're
Yeah.
words. Do you like music because you like it makes you dance, it makes you excited, it makes you happy, it makes you sad, it brings out emotion. But what it does, it's a sound is a wave. Sound moves the air. Sound touches your body. Light, video does not touch your body. Light is invisible. Light goes into your eyeballs, into your brain, and it registers there. But sound, you have a physical reaction to. The bass sound. Why do people like low? Because it hits your chest. Why do you like highs? So the range of sound, the magic of sound, music is produced. Sound is produced by musical instruments. It's produced by voices, and it's produced by words and lyrics. So it struck me. And I think there are certain people, and I am one of them, and I think probably most of your listeners who react physically and emotionally to the sensation of feeling those waves hitting their body.
Great. Yeah. What a wonderful, that's well done, sir. Nice explanation. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask a couple of basic questions. I'm always that I've had different people talk about, and so when you talk about Jimmy Iovine was the engineer on Born to Run, and at the symposium this last weekend, he was there. What are the different personnels involved? Like they always talk about this was produced by and then engineered by. Can you give a everything you wanted to know in a summary of because I never understand the difference between those different roles in a sound studio.
Yeah, this is great conversation because in my old little world you get caught in your bubble and you think everybody understands, but
Yeah.
grab it. Tell your fans and your listeners to grab an
Okay.
old album, and one with a bunch of album notes on the back. Okay,
Okay.
and then album credits, and you say, okay. So at the top is the band, right? The top is Bruce, and the top is the musicians who are in the band. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the crew. That's the band. Those are the artists. There's another layer of performers who you've got to pay attention to, right?
Yeah.
They're not part of the band. They supplement the band.
Okay.
They make the band sound better in the studio. They're the studio musicians. They're not in the band. They're the Brecker brothers. You'll see, you got Clarence Clemens playing horns, but who are these Brecker brothers? The Brecker's brothers are these studio musicians who make a living going room to room, working with band to band, and filling out the band, helping out the band, making sounds that the band can't create themselves. Those are the studio musicians.
One of the most famous, right, is the Wrecking Crew from Los Angeles, California, and then I know there's a name for the Nashville during the heyday of the Nashville sound. There was this whole
There's
group.
always a crew, but there's always like the guys in town who supplement the
Yeah.
musicians. Don't assume any album is only the performance of the band and the artist,
Okay.
because that's the beauty of the studio. You can
Yeah.
bring them. They're not on stage. You can supplement them.
Okay.
And these guys are some of the best musicians. All right. Now, oftentimes, and the mysteries of recording studios, the guitarist and I won't talk individual stories, the guitarist may appear to be the lead guitarist on the band, but it's not. It's one of those studio musicians. That's the magic of the studio. You don't know. Okay. So then beyond the studio musicians, They're the guys who put the deal together, who make it all work, who pay the bills, who play shrink to the artists, who give input to the artist, who get the artist to go home and to take a nap or stop drinking so much or playing a certain way or getting a riff. That's the producer. That's the role of a producer, is to basically run the business of the band, run the art of the band, make sure the artist gets things done, but also become a sounding board. What happened with Born to Run was, and the significant part of Born to Run was the relationship between Bruce and John Landau. This was a professional relationship that's 50 years later still in place,
Yeah.
right? Started with that band, and because John Landau not only fell in love with the artist, but understood how to bring out the artist in a new way that never had before. Bruce was not the intellectual he became until he met John Landau. John Landau had a great sense of the art, and much better to some extent than Mike Appel. That producer, whether it's a John Landau, whether Billy Joel and Phil Ramone, those relationships are critical in the creation of the art. That producer also selects the studio and also helps select the people who work in the studio. So once you select the studio, all right,
I'm gonna and I'm gonna interrupt you just for a minute. So sometimes it becomes like Bruce talks about on Broadway, 1+1 = 3, talking about the magic of the E Street Band. But like George Martin or as you said, Phil Ramone or Mike Appel, sometimes they actually are able to elevate that artist, correct?
yeah, because it's like a good editor. I had a
Yeah,
great editor of my book. She made me better. It was this passionate outside view that got me out of my head and got me thinking possibly in a different way.
yeah,
So that relationship's critical, not only from the creating the art, and John Landau did elevate the art of Bruce Springsteen. There's no question about it. But he
yeah.
also he picked the record plan,
Hmm.
and he decided. Bruce did his first two albums at the studio where I was a student, called 914, which was up in Blauvelt, New York. It was a second-rate studio. The gear was second-rate. The maintenance was second-rate. The equipment, piano was broken. He wasn't Born to
Yeah,
Run. The song was recorded in 914, and it's clear anybody could hear it. Can hear this. It sounds different than the rest of the album. And that rest of the album was recorded in Record Plan, which was selected by John Landau, and a major decision. He said to Bruce, "You're a first-class artist. You deserve a first-class studio." Roy Bittan told John, based on the Peter Carlin book, to go
yeah.
there. Although there is some other stories that you should explore about how Bruce ended up at Record Plant. But nonetheless, that was John Landau's job. So he ends up at
Yeah.
Record Plant. He
One
needs,
more question about producers. I'm sorry, Barton. I'm geeking out on this, and you're on a roll, and I apologize. So, what is when like Brian Wilson talks is produced himself? How is that different than this other relationship you're talking about?
there are some artists, and they can be. Think about it outside. Think about a movie star who directs himself.
Okay,
So think about a movie star becomes a producer. You see the credits all the time on the
right.
movies.
And sometimes it's just an honorary title to make them a little more money, and other times they're actually working producers, right?
But Brian Wilson, some of the greatest geniuses of all time, and you got to say Brian Wilson is one of them, right?
Thank you. Yes.
But Brian Wilson knew how to get that sound that he heard in his head onto tape.
Okay.
He had a very clear vision. Our artists who wanted the freedom and wanted to break free of the relationship with their producer. It became a contentious relationship. Rock and roll is filled with relationships between producers and artists who fall apart. Most famously, Jimi Hendrix at Record Plant.
Yeah.
The Record Plant was started for Jimi Hendrix in 1968 at Record Plant, where he did Electric Ladyland. He had a producer, Chaz Chandler, who was one of the producer of The Animals, and he realized he didn't want a producer. He wanted to make it himself. Brian Wilson was like that. Bruce was not like that.
Okay.
Bruce needed that sounding board. Doesn't make him any better or worse. just different. The way he needed somebody to respond to him and direct him, and that
Mhm.
relationship is very different.
Okay.
So when you
Please.
go to
Thank you for sharing that. Okay.
so when you go to the producer selects the studio, John Landau produced record plant. You need an engineer. All right. Well, we'll take Born to Run as an example of how to
Please.
scope out what this hierarchy is. John Landau's there with Mike Appel. They decided to go to Record Plant. Record Plant was famous for one thing, a lot of things at that point, but most importantly, it was John Lennon's home. John Lennon entire post Beatles catalog was recorded at Record Plant, New York.
Okay.
All right. And John got there in 1970 to work on Imagine, went out west to work during the Lost Weekend on, he did Mind Games, he did Rock and Roll album, and he worked with a guy named Roy Cicala. Roy Cicala owned Record Plant New York. He was the chief engineer of Record Plant New York, and he was the genius, audio genius at Record Plant New York.
Okay.
Everybody wanted to work with Roy because he was John Lennon's engineer. And there's no question that when John Landau decided to go to Record Plant, he expected to work with Roy Cicala. He wanted to work with John Lennon's engineer. You got a first-rate artist, you got a first-rate studio. You want the best engineer. You wanted Roy.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Bruce Springsteen didn't deserve or wasn't worthy of Roy Cicala in those days. Roy Cicala was top of the world. He didn't need a what he called a high maintenance, low rent artist like Bruce Springsteen to work with. So what he did was he gave him another engineer. Now let me explain to you what an engineer does.
Please do. Yes.
Engineer is the geek. He's the tweak. He's the nerd. He's the guy with the slide rule in his jacket and the
Pocket
headphone and
protector and
pocket
yeah.
protector.
Yeah. Okay.
He's that tech bro who loved audio, like that. I was
Okay.
like me. If I was any good, I would have been an engineer. Right now, an engineer codes, maybe he codes, right? In
Yeah.
those days, he tweaked tape machines because the equipment that Bruce and John Landau and the E Street Band walked into was very expensive. It was old analog tape, and it was big tape machines that cost $40,000 and mixing consoles that could tweak the sounds. And those mixing consoles cost $100,000 and needed a geek to know how to operate it. You
Okay.
needed a geek who knew how to put a microphone in Bruce's face and get the right sound on it. You needed a maintenance team engineer who could keep it going. That was the engineer. And
Okay.
because Bruce was not Roy worthy, so to speak, he got Roy's assistants. He got the kids who had the experience working with Roy, had experience as a result working with John Lennon, and he gave the job to Jimmy Iovine. Jimmy Iovine was the engineer on that job, on the Born to Run album. He ran the sessions, he ran the equipment, he helped Landau get the sound he was after. We talk about in my presentation at the Monmouth University, I talked about Record Plant starting with Jimi Hendrix in 1968, becoming the
Yeah.
home of John Lennon in the early 70s, and then coming to the top of its game in 75 with Born to Run. I connected Jimi Hendrix jammed in the studio. He liked to jam. John liked to work. He was trained in the EMI school of recording, and Bruce was always searching. Bruce didn't know how to get what he wanted. He didn't know how to operate the equipment. Never really wasn't sophisticated in the studio. He needed an engineer like Jimmy Iovine
Okay.
to help. Now, below the engineer, every engineer has to have assistants, right? Because for a lot of reasons. One, there's a lot of equipment to work on. So you need help. You need somebody to turn the tape machine on while you're putting in the mics. You need somebody to run into the studio when something breaks. You need somebody to help you at the console work the controls because you only have two hands. You need four hands or six hands. Jimmy Iovine had a guy named Tom Panunzio as assistant. Now,
Okay.
Tom Panunzio is often forgotten in the leg, but Tom Panunzio was probably the better of the two engineers. He was an assistant. And one thing about Jimmy Iovine that you got to give him credit for, he always knew how to get people who were better with him than him technically to work with him. And you know what? Tom Panunzio was that guy. And
Okay. Interesting.
Tom went off years later to work with Joan Jett and Patti Smith and John Lennon, and he worked with Jimmy Iovine when Jimmy became a label executive at Interscope. He built Hit Factory. He built A&M Studios. He became a legendary label executive. Fantastic guy. So he was the assistant.
Okay.
And then below the assistant, there was the tape operator. All right. The tape operator was the guy who literally put the tape on the machine, pressed pause, stop, record, and made sure the tape, you got what you needed on the tape. Because I don't care how many times Bruce would record a song, 30, 50 times, whatever, all of those things had to be recorded. And if you lost them, the tape machine broke, or somebody didn't press record, you didn't get the goods.
Yeah.
So it was very much an interesting environment, and it was built on one model. Okay, you had to have the best gear, you had to have a good trained engineer, but record plant, like every studio in those days, was a business, and you rent. The key capital of the business was you needed cheap, hardworking, dedicated kids to run the place. And when it came to rock and roll, and like me, when I was that kid, anybody would work for $1 an hour just to get in the room with Bruce Springsteen, just to get in the room with John Lennon.
Yeah.
And there was no shortage of kids. And that was how the studio operated. And that's really the environment that Bruce walked into in the spring of 75 to finish up Born to Run.
So what, and you explained this, but I'd like you to expand a little more. First off, I was wondering if, like, when John Landau says, you're a top-notch artist, you need a top-notch studio, explain the difference, and also your thought, because I would think if I'm Michael Pell, I'm like, yeah, I'd love a better studio too, because I hear people who you should have blank on the podcast. I'm like, yeah, that's nice. One of the stories, and I'll let you talk in a minute, I promise, but I love the story. Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller tells the story that toward the end of his mother's life, she got to be friends with Bill Cosby's mother. And Penn's mom called and says, I was talking to whatever Mrs. Cosby's name was, and she says that it really helped Bill to be on the Tonight Show. So you should get on the Tonight Show. Thank you, Mom. I appreciate that. Thoughts on why was it a better studio, and why couldn't Mike Appel have picked, quote unquote, a better studio? If you can share any part of that.
Okay, so let's talk about some in-depth studio history as we get
I
there.
would love this. Thank you.
All right,
I hope I'm not nerding you out too much.
Oh man, you're getting me. Listen, this is my passion, and I'm
Good.
be able to
Good.
talk to your audience about it. So here's what's going on, right? What does a recording studio sell? It sells you a room, equipment, people to record, all right? But it's really selling you one thing. It's selling you time. You pay them by the hour. Record plan, and everything was negotiable. But let's say record plan was costing them about $160, $175 an hour for 6 months in the studio.
Wow, and in the 70s, that's a lot of money today.
A lot of
But
money,
back then,
right?
yeah,
That's a lot of money. Now, you not only that, but you're paying $100 plus for a reel of tape.
yeah,
And I don't know how many hours. I can't tell you that. I can't tell you how many reels of tape. I can't tell you how many engineers are working. I can tell you that it was not cheap to record Born to Run at Record
yeah,
Plant.
yeah,
So if you can get a room that's $75 an hour,
yeah.
you're saving a lot of money. When Bruce worked at 914 on his first two albums, he worked in a studio that was inexpensive for a lot of reasons. Okay, 914 was inexpensive because it was out of the way. Wasn't in Midtown New York, so the real estate was cheap,
Yeah.
right? Number two, it was an old garage, so acoustically, remember, you needed to build an environment, a room that was built perfectly for the best sound. Not only
Right.
did you have to have the best equipment, but you had to have a perfect acoustical environment where the
Right.
instrument sounded right, where it could be recorded. That's expensive. It was an old garage, that place.
Yeah.
You needed a very good engineering team, and to be fair, Louis Lahab was a great engineer and is a great engineer still. The famous Israeli engineer, did the two albums with Bruce up
Yeah.
there. But he also was the maintenance engineer. He was one set of hands in the place. He didn't have a team. He didn't have assistants on anything. He was
Yeah.
doing the whole damn thing. Brooks Arthur was a famous record producer who owned 50% of 914. And Brooks and I talked, and Brooks told the story that he used to help Bruce out with gas money to drive back to Jersey after a late night.
Wow.
Bruce didn't have anything. He was broke.
Yeah.
And you know what? Sometimes they would give him free studio time if the place was open, if they believed in him enough. But
Yeah.
it was a low rent place. It was 50% owned by A&R Studios in New York and 50% owned by Brooks Arthur. What happened? And this goes back to legend of John Landau saying Bruce needed a first-rate studio. 914 was going out of business in the spring of 1975 too. John Landau wanted to get out of there not only because it was falling apart physically, but business wise it was falling apart. Brooks Arthur, who owned it, actually, interestingly enough, quit, gave up his shares in the business, and he went to produce a record in New York for Janis Ian.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And that famous album came out in the September of that year and became a number one for her. But Brooks
Yeah.
Arthur, guess where Brooks Arthur went to produce Janis Ian after he left 914 and left Bruce up there? He tells the story that, you guess, where do you think he went to work?
I have no idea.
He went to work at Record Plant.
Ah, okay.
So just here's what happened. Bruce is working at 914, right? The
Yeah.
boss that runs the place quits and says, I'm done with this crap. I'm going to produce a record at a great studio called Record Plant, right?
Hmm.
So Record Plant not only got that, so they heard about it because Brooks went there. And Brooks told the story about when last time he left 914, as he closed the door and listened in the background, Bruce was recording Born to Run.
Wow.
So not only was Brooks Arthur going there, but there was also, and again, your fans know more about this than me, and I don't want to get into this too deeply, but there were some issues about Suki and Bruce and Louis, and maybe there were some things going on that would put a little tension between them. So
Yeah.
Bruce needed to get out of there anyway.
Okay.
All right. And so if they're looking for a first-rate studio, not only did Brooks Arthur go there, all right, but
Yeah.
interesting enough, if you were looking for a first-rate studio, what would you do? You go to, in those days, Sam Goody. It was a record store. You go to some record store. You look at the back of the album credits and see what studio shows up the most. But
Right. That makes sense.
1975. Okay, let me tell you what was in the record racks. Okay, with Record Plant on the background. Jimi Hendrix's first posthumous album, Crash Landing, came out. All right, made in Record Plant. John Lennon's rock and roll album came out, recorded at Record Plant. David Bowie's Young Americans, recorded at Record Plant. Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic, Record Plant. And the number one album in the country in that spring of 75 was done in Record Plant, LA, Eagles, One of These Nights.
Wow.
So Bruce was looking for a first-rate studio. You know, you're going to go to a first-rate studio, and that was Record Plant. Now so they're going over to Record Plant, and here's a really interesting thing that everybody misses. Record Plant was John Lennon's studio. All right, everybody loved John. John worked there with Yoko. He played there with Mick Jagger. He recorded with Elton John there. He did all his post Beatles work there.
Yeah.
They loved John. Everybody, they were family. All right.
Okay.
Right? And John had just finished the rock and roll album. He was ready to record another album, and he had a band coming together. He had booked the time, and guess what? John Lennon finds out that Yoko's pregnant.
Okay.
75. He says, you know what? I'm not making another record. He goes to Royce Cal and says, sorry, the new album's off. I'm retiring. Guess what? What happens? Remember, Royce Cal, Record Plant's in the business of renting studio time.
Yeah.
The room is open.
Yeah, like he's canceled a reservation. So now then there's an open suite of hotel rooms, right?
Let me tell you something. Royce Cal's not making money if that room's empty.
Exactly.
He's still paying Jimmy Iovine. He's still paying Tom Panunzio. So John Lennon quits the Aerosmith. Interestingly enough, important
Yeah.
point. Just finishes Toys in the Attic. They're done. They're leaving the studio.
Yeah.
There's some empty space. Guess what? I don't know what John Landau negotiated. I don't know what the deal was, but it was one of those rare times when Record Plant had a room.
Yeah, and there maybe, it's there anyway. All right, anything I'm making is better than nothing. As you said, no idea, but it was a happy accident,
It was a
right?
happy accident and let me tell you what also happened at that time. When John retires, studios open. What happens to the kids? Jimmy
Yeah,
Iovine, all right, had just finished working with Lennon.
yeah,
I just spent some time in LA with Roy and Lennon doing the rock and roll album and working with Harry Nilsson on the Pussycats album. He goes back to becoming an assistant.
yeah.
Guess what Tom Panunzio does, his assistant? He
Hmm.
goes back to working in the tape room, making tape duplications.
Yeah,
There's no work for them. In works Bruce. Roy doesn't want to do Bruce. He gives it to his kid, this kid named Jimmy Iovine. And you know what? The important thing is the other side to this. Remember, not only was Roy the number one engineer Record Plant in those days, but there were
yeah,
other number ones. There was a guy named Shelly Yakis, who was Roy's number two, had worked on all this work had worked with Roy on all the Lennon work, brilliant ears, had some hits with Cranberries at that time. He didn't get the job with Bruce. He had
yeah,
another guy named Jay Messina who just finished Aerosmith with Jack Douglas. He didn't
yeah.
get Bruce didn't even warrant Jay Messina or Shelly Yakis. He got Jimmy Iovine. Now, let's talk a little bit about Jimmy, if you don't mind.
Oh
Okay.
no, please.
All right. Because Jimmy, like you were there. You saw Jimmy Iovine on stage with Bruce, with the E Street Band, talking about the making of the album. Now, your fans know who he is. If they don't know who Jimmy Iovine is, he's a billionaire. He,
Yeah, they HBO did a whole documentary, right, on him and Dr. Dre. Just yeah,
And and not only was a major record executive, worked with U2, famously did Tom Petty, Damn the Torpedoes, Stevie Nicks, U2. You can go on and on. Started a record label called Interscope, which he sold to Geffen. He's one of these movers and shakers who's always just touches money. Now, he was probably the richest man on that stage with Bruce and Little Stevie, and all those guys.
yeah, absolutely.
But in those days, Jimmy Iovine was a hustling young kid from Brooklyn who wanted to be in the studio business, who had a great personality, everybody loved, worked his ass off, and everybody fell in love with him. But he was not really a great engineer. It was not really that great an engineer, but knew how to work for the artist, knew how to help the artist get sound, and frankly wanted to be a producer like John Landau more than becoming a recording engineer.
Yeah.
The Not only did John Landau mentor and work with Bruce, but he mentored Jimmy Iovine.
Mm,
But it was Roy Cicala who gave him his start. And
okay.
they even called him Jimmy Shoes around the studio. He had a nickname. His nickname wasn't Jimmy Iovine, it was Jimmy Shoes because he used to spend all his money on these fancy high heel boots in those days because he was short and he wanted to feel a little stature. So he was a great character. He had just worked with Lennon. He learned from Phil. He worked with Lennon and Phil Spector how to get that wall of sound, which was also a big attraction for Landau and Bruce because they wanted that wall of sound, that Phil Spector wall of
Sure.
sound. So Jimmy Iovine was really an important character, but he didn't really. I think even Bruce in his book referred to him as a brilliant imposter, and
Yeah.
but he knew how to pull it off, and he led the team. Now, Bruce was not an easy patient in the record plant, let's say. He was not an easy client. Where Roy Cicala was, Roy didn't need to work with a musician who never knew when enough was enough. Bruce, what did Jimmy say on stage? Again,
Two
right?
words, right? No and again.
No
Were
one
the
again.
only two words he thought he knew.
That's it, man. It was again, the number of takes were endless. And the one thing you needed an engineer to do besides being able to run that equipment is stay awake.
Yes.
They would, and one of the things that, Dave Thainer was another one of those assistants on that job. There were there were four engineers basically. There was Jimmy, who was the main engineer, Tom Benunzio, who was his assistant, and then a couple guys named Dave Thainer and Corky Stasiak. Corky and
Hmm.
Dave had just finished working on the Aerosmith Toys in the Attic album when they came in to help. So they had a bunch of assistants. And Thainer told a great story that once late at night, after a long night of working with Bruce over and over again and again, Jimmy Ive fell asleep at the console with his feet up on the console. And so it was his job to roll Jimmy over on the side and take over the console. Always, the assistants and the kids were always covering for themselves. That was the way it worked. You always
Sure.
covered. You helped each other out. They're your buddies. You were in the battle. So the big challenge for Appel and for Landau was to get engineers in there who could stay awake. There's a
Yeah.
famous story that Tom Panunzio told me that Appel was what? He was a military background. I don't know if it was Marines or Army, whatever.
Yeah.
But he knew a technique from the military where if you were on guard through the night, how to keep yourself awake. So at one point during the session, he sees the engineers falling asleep, and he sees them and he says, "Wait a minute, come here." He pulls out a juicy fruit piece of gum out of his pocket, but he doesn't give him the gum. He gives him the silver foil wrapper,
Yes.
and he hands on it. It says, "Chew on this." And this old military thing, you know what it's like to chew on a piece of silver foil?
Ugh.
It puts a shot through your brain. And every
Yes.
time I saw those engineers falling asleep, to keep them going, he gave them that piece of silver foil and said, "Chew on this."
That's crazy.
So
Yeah, I love that. So talk why what led to you, obviously this is a passion for you and you have loved, loved hearing that passion in your voice. What led to the book?
the book, sometimes like any passion, I don't care if you fall in love with Bruce Springsteen and go to one concert and then go to 100, right?
Yeah.
You fall down that rabbit hole. This is your passion, right? You fell down
Right.
this rabbit hole of trying to understand the fans and working with the
Yeah.
fans. This is your rabbit. We all fall in our rabbit hole. Years later, I'd wanted done this book years ago, couldn't do it, and then Chris Stone, and I'll explain a little about him in a moment.
Okay.
Important part of the came to me, and so I'm ready to tell the stories. He was living in LA. I was in LA for a lot of business. We spent a lot of time hanging out in his backyard and talking. And I ran the tape machine,
Hmm.
and I realized a few things. Remember, Bruce Springsteen was Born to Run was only one of 100 of albums that were great albums that were recorded in Record Plant. Record
Yeah.
Plant, you can talk about what else? I mentioned all of John Lennon's work in New York. There were three record plants. There was one in New York, the original where Bruce worked. There was this next one in LA, most famously for Stevie, where they did Stevie Wonder's complete classic period, where Eagles did all its albums, where the Eagles did Hotel California. And then there was Sausalito up on the west, up near San Francisco, where Sly Stone worked famously, and where most famously Fleetwood Mac Rumors was recorded.
Okay.
I said, wait a minute, there's so many albums, and it's such a huge story. So I said, all right, you know what? I'm just going to write a story I can write a book about New York. But then I realized New York is only part of the story. So I
Yeah.
got into LA, and I could have written a book about LA. I could have still written a book just about each of them, but I tried to stitch them together and explain what was unique about the record plant hit making formula, where they could produce so many hits over and over again and
Hmm.
inconsistently. And number two, how the personalities, Chris Stone being the guy I talked to, Chris Stone was the guy who hired Roy Cicala to work originally with Jimi Hendrix and then with John. And also, Chris had a partner named Gary Kellgren, who was the acoustical genius of the business and built and helped build the rooms and outfit the rooms in the way that they were so technically interesting. I was interested in that. And what really struck me, though, is the connection between an environment and creativity. Just
Yeah.
thinking of a basic thing. Can you create an environment, a studio, a workspace that inspires you to greatness? And the one
Right.
thing Record Plant was the sheer number of hits that came out of Record Plant. In 75 was really important to note. you need to put Born to Run in the context of what else was going on in record plant at that time. And we
Mhm.
talked so much about 50 years ago. The In 1975, end of 75, beginning of 76, 76 at record plant became its most famous period. 1 year
Yeah.
later, after Bruce's release, three albums came out of record plant that changed the way the record business worked. Hotel California,
Yeah.
the Eagles, done at record plant LA. Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, recorded in record plant Sausalito. And Songs of the Key of Life, that was done both in LA and a few other studios, but LA, Sausalito, another studio called Crystal Sound, but was part of the record plant production. Those three albums, not including British, have sold 100 million albums.
Yeah.
Changed the record business. And it's the formula that record plant had that was able to consistently make these albums, and that's what was unique about them. And I was intrigued by what was that magic mojo that they came up with. What was the
Hmm.
formula? So I started talking to people, and the
Yeah.
same thing as you really get into the basics of the fan experience and
Yeah.
the personality of your audience. I found out that you were talking earlier about the hierarchy. There were the fan, there was the
Yeah.
artist, there was the band, there were the musicians, the producer. There was a whole hundreds and hundreds of people out there who had worked at record plant in ways that people don't even think. They were the janitors. They were
Yeah.
they worked the front desk. They drove the trucks. They cleaned up at night. They did everything. And I said, wait a minute, they have the best, and they had the best stories. So I started interviewing them, just like you
Yeah.
interviewed me. And they all had the best stories to tell. So the book really was formed for them, and the book's dedicated to them. It's not dedicated to the stars. It's dedicated to those people who really made these buildings work, made these environments create some of the greatest music of that era. And that was my goal of the book.
Yeah. Do you have, I don't want to you give away all the great stories, but you have a story you want to share that surprised you maybe that you went, wow, I did not know this. That's that's cool.
I got lots of stories. The book is filled with those stories. There's a
Yeah.
story. But again, I can go on and on. But one of the funny stories, and we were talking a lot about Aerosmith in New York. And there's a few key stories, and I could tell a couple of you. One
Yo,
is
I'd love to, please.
the here we are in New York. New York had, it's important to understand that New York had two studios where Bruce worked, two studios on the downstairs, one studio up on the 10th floor. All right. And the
Yeah.
10th floor studio was Studio C. It was built for Jimi Hendrix to keep him working there before he built his own studio.
Yeah.
That's where Born to Run was. The final mixes were done, and the rehearsals for Born to Run were done up on that 10th floor. It was also a few months earlier, before Bruce went in there. It's where Aerosmith was working on Toys in the Attic, and they were struggling for a hit. They didn't have a hit. Joe Perry, the guitarist, had a riff, but they couldn't come up with the lyrics, and they were struggling. And there's nothing better than saying, you know what? Let's take a break. Let's go outside.
Okay.
Now, it's important to understand about record playing, not only just for Aerosmith, but for John Lennon and Bruce, that it was a very seedy part of town in those days.
Okay.
Record playing was Times Square. It was hookers, it was heroin, it was dirty, it was funky, seedy part of town, right?
Yeah.
And when you left record plant, whether you went home for the night to the hotel, or went to the train station or the bus station, or you went to your hotel room, you walked through Times Square. So that environment had a real impact on the music that was made and the songs that were made there. It also had first run movie theaters, being Times
Okay.
Square. And here's
Okay.
Aerosmith saying, "Let's take a break." They go out into Times Square, and they go into a movie theater, and they see the Mel Brooks movie Young Frankenstein is playing. Just
Yes.
released, right? We know that song, and there's that movie, a great movie. And there's a scene with the Hunchback, right? Marty
Yes.
Feldman, right? Famous scene. He picks some people up at I guess the train station, and taking them to the castle, and he says, "Walk this way," and he does the "Walk this way" Hunchback shuffle, right? Remember that? And
Yes.
everybody else walks this way. They do the
Yeah.
shuffle like him, right?
Yeah.
That cracked up Steve Taylor. That cracked up the band, and all the way back to the studio from Young Frankenstein when it's over, they're walking through Times Square doing the Hunchback shuffle, doing the walk this way.
Yeah.
They go up to the studio, they go up in the elevator to the studio, and they go into, and Tyler says, "Give me a few minutes." He goes into the stairwell and writes the lyrics to "Walk This Way," famous song, and the song makes history.
Oh, I graduated high school in 77. So I remember that era, right? That was that 8 track, that's how old I was epic.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. We talk about that Studio C on the top on the 10th floor of Record Plant, New York, which the building is still there. Your fans can walk by it. You can go in the lobby. There's even a mural, and you can see murals on 8th Avenue. It's on 44th Street off of 8th Avenue. So you can
Yeah.
it's called the building is even still called the Plant. And up on there's another thing that I think is important for people to know about Record Plant, which was unique for a New York studio. It had an outdoor space. Now, when you're working in a studio, it's high pressure, it's
Yeah.
exhausting. You need to be able to get some fresh air. And not a lot of studios had an outdoor space. The ability to go out on a rooftop
Yeah.
overlooking Times Square was a great escape for that 10th floor studio. Jimi Hendrix used to go up there and fly paper airplanes onto Times Square. John Lennon had some great photographs taken up there. The Carlin book talks about a big yelling fight between Mike Appel and John Landau out on that roof. It was where that roof, years later, that Bruce and the band came back to photograph all their PR shots for Darkness. Those were
Mm.
all taken by Frank Stefanko up on the Record Plant roof.
Yeah.
So that roof was an important part of the scenery. And like I said, it overlooked Times Square. And I think everybody talks about Born to Run and Bruce as being a Jersey artist, but I think it's an important part of the Record Plant magic. I think there is got to be some lyrical influence, if not sonic influence, of Times Square on Bruce's music at that time.
Yeah.
And you decide whether Jungle Land was New Jersey or Times Square. It certainly was recorded in Times Square.
Yeah. It has that feeling, right?
Yep.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Another story that's a popular story that I remember Jimmy Iovine got famous years later working with Stevie Nicks, but before then she was the new singer for the Fleetwood Mac working up at Record
Yeah.
Plant Toledo. And part of the deal with Record Plant was, yeah, you wanted an artist like Bruce for 6 months, but what you really wanted was a Jimmy. Why? Because Jimi Hendrix would work 6 hours a day for 2 years at a time. He would block book his studio, so he could get in there anytime he wanted, and it was $1 million studio client a year, which was huge money in those days. You always
Yeah.
wanted a Jimmy, and they had Jimmy in New York. They got Stevie Wonder for his entire classic period, the block book Studio B in L.A. And they built a strange room in Sausalito for Sly Stone.
Okay.
Sly Stone wanted a very unique recording studio. He wanted it underground. He wanted to dig a hole in the ground and put all the equipment at the bottom of this pit, which was what it was called, where he could record at the bottom of the pit, and the musicians would sit on the ledges around the pit, and they build them a little bedroom off the side of the pit. Remember, these guys were into selling studio time. If there was money, and remember, he was also a Columbia artist in those days. He was getting CBS money, just like Bruce, just like Aerosmith. There was a lot of CBS money going to Record Plant in those days. So they built him Sly Spoon the Pit. Now, like anything you'd expect, it was cool. It was hippy dippy, but it sounded like crap.
Okay.
There was never really one hit by Sly Stone that ever came out of that pit in Sausalito, but there was a hit by Fleetwood Mac. Because remember, if you've ever heard the stories of the making of Rumors, it was a very stressful time for Fleetwood Mac. They
Yes.
were up there were breakups. Even a show called Stereophonic on Broadway that plays off of it. But it was a stressful, a lot of cocaine, a lot of drugs. It was a bad time for the band. She needed a break from the band, so she wandered into the studio. She wandered into Sly Stone's pit, and she goes into Sly Stone's bedroom. Stevie Nicks on Sly Stone's bedroom in Record Plant, Sausalito, gets out and sits on this beautiful bedspread, and she crosses her legs, and she pulls out a little keyboard. In Sly Stone's bedroom at Record Plant, Sausalito, in 10 minutes is where Stevie Nicks wrote their most famous song, Dreams.
You hear the phrase, if these walls could talk. And that's actually what to not overly simplify it, but Buzz Me In, the Inside Record Plant Studios, it is that idea of sharing the stories of that.
Well,
So go ahead, please.
no, and I think that you mentioned the title and you started it early, and I said to get into it. So this is really would be a good time to
Yes.
explain it because,
I have a slight that was we're on sync because that was going to be my next question. I assume, but please share the story.
all right. So remember, studios are private, secretive places. You
Yeah.
don't, Bruce didn't want the record labels coming in to hear his music. All right. He didn't want some big shot to come in and give him his 2 cents. He wanted to be left alone. These are creative environments. And when Gary
Yeah.
Kellgren and Chris Stone and Royce and Keller built these places, they were built to be private. You
Yeah.
could, if you're working in a studio, there was a lock. You could lock the door so nobody could come in. So they needed to lock the place up. There were fans trying to get in the doors, especially in New York when Lennon was there. They used the
Oh, yeah.
throngs of fans were always there trying to get in there. Bruce
Oh, I
didn't.
can imagine.
You can imagine that when the people found out that John Lennon's recording there. My gosh! So they needed
Yeah.
security. In LA, they especially needed security because LA was a very different environment than New York. Remember, New York's an office building. In,
Yeah.
in, in LA, they had plenty of room. They had plenty of room to build 3 big studios. They had a parking lot. It had a wall around it. But it was a party. LA became a real party scene. LA was drugs, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I say sex, drugs, and audio.
Yeah.
They even put mirrors on the consoles so people could snort cocaine. There was a jacuzzi. There were back rooms where people could sleep and do whatever they wanted. It was a funky, crazy, hippy dippy scene in
Yeah.
those days. Very unlike New York was more straight and narrow down to business. LA was a party because they had the room for it.
Yeah.
And remember, they were selling time, so they didn't care if the artist was in the jacuzzi or playing pinball or sleep in the room. They were charging them for that studio time. Yeah, it was to keep them there. You know what? The clubs in LA closed at 2 o'clock at night. Most famously, the Rainbow.
Okay.
Where did the parties go after 2 o'clock? They went to Record Plant LA. All right, and the groupies, everybody wanted to get in. You couldn't get in. You couldn't get in unless you knew the code word. They had a
Right.
night. They had a nightman. All right. Eagles, Hotel California. We'll talk about that in a minute. Nightman at the front desk. His guy name was Michael Gately, and the code word was "Buzz me in, Gately." You couldn't get into and that became the code word for in LA music scene in the mid 70s. Buzz me in. That was in. There was a buzz lock in New York as well. You had to get
Hmm.
buzzed into the studio. And not surprisingly, LA, with its jacuzzi and hotel rooms and drug, sex, and rock and roll, became a where the Eagles wrote Hotel California. There's a lot of questions or whatever about whether it is Hotel California. I don't think that's the point. The
No.
point was it inspired Hotel California. It was that kind of claustrophobic, crazy environment, very much like a hotel. And in fact, the owners did want to build a series of rock and roll hotels. That was part of their
Yeah.
mission. But I think that's New York was quite different than LA in that sense. If LA was a Hotel California, New York was much more buttoned up. Although New York had its own culture, and
Yeah.
one of the things to talk about New York was it was a bit of a sitcom environment. Royce O'Connell was a bit of a crazy guy. He
Hmm.
fell in love with fire extinguishers. If an engineer was sleeping at his desk, he'd take a fire extinguisher and blast away at him. They would have fire extinguisher fights in the hallway. They would take an artist and put a gaffer tape in, or an assistant, whatever, gaffer tape them to a rolling chair and roll them out into the middle of Times Square. It was a crazy, funky place because Roy had that kind of vibe. There was another major client at that time at Record Plant, a producer, not John Landau, named Bob Ezrin. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bob,
No.
but Bob Ezrin very famously produced at Record Plant, New York, before Bruce was there. Alice Cooper's School's Out and Billionaire Babies, Billion Dollar Babies. He
Yeah.
recorded Destroyer with Kiss at Record Plant.
Okay.
And he worked with a young engineer by the name of Jimmy Iovine.
Okay. Always goes back to Jimmy.
It always Jimmy was a kid. Jimmy was just starting out a record plant with working for Bob Ezrin, and Bob Ezrin was a madman. Talk about the old days of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This guy was. He knew how to party, but he also knew how to do some crazy stuff. If he wanted a sound, he would drop a microphone down a stairwell and listen to it crashing. He would put these people through craziness. And
Yeah.
he would drive Jimmy Iovine nuts and see how hard he can push him. And that was part of Ezrin's deal with Roy. He would push the assistants so hard, do the craziest things. And if the engineers kept up with him, they were keepers. Jimmy Iovine kept up with Roy's buddy Bob Ezrin. And there's
Hmm.
a famous story that Bob and Roy and the band were going down to 8th Avenue one night for a steak. And they were out when Jimmy Iovine's with the band, yucking it up in front. And Roy and Bob are in the background watching Jimmy having a fun, putting on a show. And they looked at this kid and Bob Ezrin turned to Roy and said, "See that kid up there?" And he said, "Yeah, we made him." And
Wow.
Jimmy Iovine will tell you, admittedly, when he got his Grammy and everything, that it was the influence of the training of Roy Sakala and to a great extent Bob Ezrin, producer Bob Ezrin, that got him his start, got him working with Roy with Lennon, and got him ready to work with Landau when Bruce came in. Landau became his mentor, no question about it. But Roy Sakala is the one who gave him his start, and Bob Ezrin was the one who told Roy this kid was a keeper.
That's awesome. That is so good. The book, Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios. Martin, I feel like we could talk another hour, but I want people to go read the book. This has been amazing. Any final thoughts before I ask you the Mary question?
Let me give you a couple. Can I give you one other quick couple?
You're as many as you want to share, my friend.
There's a
This
couple
has
other
been great.
points. There's
Yeah.
a couple other points. One, you're at Record Plant, spring of 1975. Bruce Springsteen working with Jimmy Iovine and John Landau, Mike Appel. A copy of Rolling Stone magazine comes in the door. That week's Rolling Stone. What's in that stone? What's the article in that Rolling Stone? There's an article by John Landau, who's still a journalist, remember, at that point.
Okay.
All right. Still writing for Rolling Stone. And it's a review of an album that was very close to Record Plant, John Lennon's rock and roll album.
Hmm.
So here, John Landau is a customer working with Bruce Springsteen in a room with all engineers and in an environment that where John Lennon's home. And what he did, he trashed the hell out of John Lennon's rock and roll album.
Wow.
Couldn't have endeared him very much to the team at Record Plant when he's working there. So
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to remember. And I think the other thing to remember is also that Bruce came back to Record Plant to work with Jimmy Iovine for Darkness a couple years later. You remember, he went out on tour,
Yes.
on Born to Run tour. There was a Record Plant truck that rolled around on that tour and recorded many of the recordings that were in the live albums, 1975 to 85. Those albums a lot of those were recorded by the Record Plant truck. And Bruce went back to do Darkness with Jimmy and John. Jimmy, people may not realize, was also working at the same time he was working with Bruce on Darkness at Record Plant with
Okay.
John. He was working across the hall with Patti Smith on Easter.
Hmm.
And though he was the engineer on Bruce, he was the producer on Easter with Patti Smith. At the same time, those albums were recorded at Record Plant. And talk about being mentored by John Landau. He'd be in the room with Bruce, learning from John Landau how to be a producer. And he'd be taking those lessons across the hall to Patti. It's very important for people to see those two albums as being companions. And remember, they were done at the same time by Jimmy Iovine at Record Plant.
Wow. That is awesome. So I end every podcast with the Mary question. We joked a little bit about this before I hit record. I realize you're not a Bruce expert, you're a sound expert, but Jay Armstrong was a honors English teacher in the Philadelphia area. He's now retired and is a full-time writer. But when he was teaching, he would give his students the lyrics to Thunder Road, and they would talk about as if it was a poem and would discuss the themes and the imagery Bruce paints with the lyrics. And then he would ask his class, does Mary get in the car? So, Martin, that is your question. What's your opinion? Do you think Mary gets in the car?
I think I think, and this, I hope I don't disappoint you with my answer, but my answer
No.
is ambiguity and mystery is something you don't screw with. It doesn't matter, right? I know the mystery of that is what makes it such a great song and makes it such a great lyric. We tell the story in our book. Did Phil Spector almost kill John Lennon in Record Plant LA? There was a gunshot. We know it took place. We know that Phil Spector was working with John Lennon at Record Plant years before John was shot, years before Phil Spector went to jail for killing somebody. There was a gunshot at Record Plant that took place. But we were never able to track down the detail. So we told the story from six different angles, six different people telling the story six different ways. And we find that I guess my feeling in that choice, and just as much as Mary in the song, that ambiguity is what makes it great. And why ruin the mystery? It doesn't need to be one way or the other. It should be, and that's my take.
I love that answer. You are not the first person to say that. And I always think that's a great answer. It because it I remember as a kid reading The Lady or the Tiger, that short story, and it bothered me that they didn't give the answer. And now as someone who's 66, I understand that sometimes you make up the answer in yourselves, like the Sopranos ending,
Yep.
right? It's what you want it to be. Great answer, my friend. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So if someone wants to reach you, how can they?
They can go, you can go up on our Facebook page, Record Plant Diaries. We keep it fresh every day.
Okay.
Message me up on Record Plant Diaries on
Okay.
Facebook and follow it. There's a lot of Bruce stuff up there, but it'll give you a full picture of all the art and all the music that was recorded at Record Plant and all the people, and we get a lot of input from people who were there. So that's a good place to find me.
Good. I will include that link. I will also include the link for the Amazon where you can get the book. This was so much fun. Thank you for getting up on a Saturday morning to visit with me. I hope we can meet in person again. And any final thoughts before I let you out of here?
No, I think the important thing, and you did a great job with this, so thank you for that.
That's very kind of you to say.
The recording studios of that era are long gone. They're economically, they can't exist. They're lost. Many of them broken. The 10th floor studio where Bruce worked on 44th Street is still used by Sony Music, so it's still active. Unfortunately, the public can't get into them, but we can't underestimate their contribution to that music in that era. And it wasn't always those famous artists and the stars. The important thing to remember, it took a company, an organization, doing a lot of jobs to make sure that they ran, and that they deserve the respect and recognition as well.
I will cut this out if I'm throwing you a curveball, but I meant to ask you when we started the interview, you talked about sound. Since we're coming up with the new movie and Bruce is putting out Electric Nebraska, thoughts on the sound of Nebraska?
Well,
And
that's a good
yeah,
point. And I don't think you should cut this up. I think it's very relevant, and I'm glad you brought it up.
okay,
So,
good.
just knock, and again, you can, if I'm going too long, let me know.
No, I
Bruce,
Tangi, go on. Yeah.
we talk about Record Plant. Record Plant was successful because of the acoustical design of the era, but it got out of vogue.
Okay.
Not only did the equipment become increasingly less expensive and more accessible, but Bruce was after Darkness was looking for a more reverberant sound. Record Plant was a dry sound. a dead sound. You wanted a dead sound in the studio because the reverberation would have interfered. You couldn't have isolated the instruments. The dead sound, and that was what was revolutionary about Record Plant, but it went out of vogue. A couple of people from Record Plant went off and built other studios where Bruce worked, Power Station. I was born in the USA, and I was done in River, I believe was done at Hit Factory. Human Touch was done in LA. But Bruce was sick of that sound and wanted a different sound.
Okay.
By the time Nebraska came around, there was, listen, he was going through an emotional change. He wanted a more intimate, private, quiet, real sound. There
Yeah.
was a Tascam tape machine in those days. That was a revolutionary device that portended the move towards personal recording. It was Bruce didn't want other people around. He didn't want fancy producers. He didn't want an engineer. He wanted him and the record button. And what's so intimate about that album, what's so real about that album, was it was done in a very inexpensive Tascam Portastudio.
Yeah.
And in those days, I talked earlier about my friend Larry with his big tape machine and
Yeah.
how I fell in love with recording studios, and tape machines were $40,000. Here was a couple $100 box that you could put on a desk and record with.
Yeah.
And a very different experience, very personal experience. And you can hear the sound. It's not a great sound. It's not that great, but it's real. It's
Yeah.
authentic, it's personal, and it's one of his great achievements. And it was actually, if you look at it, one of the first home studios. Because
Yes.
what killed the big recording studios like Record Plant was the ability for an artist to build their own studios. Bruce
Yeah.
has his own studio. What is it, Thrill Hill right now?
Yeah.
Long back in those days, you couldn't afford that. Now you can make an album on your laptop with a microphone and a headset. A band could be all over the world. Bruce was working with the earliest home studio, personal recording device those days, and it was a harbinger of things to come for the recording business.
I'll put on your old man hat, and I don't mean that as an insult, right? Back in the day, persona, I guess is a better way to put it. Is it better, worse, or just different with the modern era?
Better in a sense is more accessible. Better because more people can create great art. Worse because musicians are not playing together as much as they used to.
Yeah.
They're working in their individual spaces and phoning it home, so to speak.
Yeah.
Digital changed a lot of things. First digital recording was done with Stephen Stills at Record Plant Studio C in LA in late 79. First digital recording. Digital recording brought a better sound quality to the albums than had because of Adam. Less hiss, but cleaner sounds, ability to make more effects. But it also brought an era when digital separated the artists and kept them apart. Born to Run was a band making an album in a recording studio.
Yeah.
In an environment that was acoustically perfect with good equipment, with people who could support them. I don't think it could be made today any other way, and I think it's unique because of that. But can you make a great record digitally? Of course. Does
Yeah.
digital give you a bigger palette for a musician to work with? Absolutely. Is it less expensive? You can make a record for nothing right now on an iPhone. Those
Yes.
days, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a studio make
Yeah.
an album. Good in the sense that more accessibility, wider distribution. Bad in the fact that I think there's a destruction of the band, which was an important part of that experience, and it was definitely a band album.
Martin, I'm thinking of the film Letter to You, right? Where, that right before the pandemic, the guys all got together and over 4 or 5 days recorded a lot of one of Bruce's last E Street Band studio albums. And right, they talked about supposedly, once again, whether it's true or not, we're going to pretend it's true, like the man who shot Liberty Valance, right? The Hey, Bruce, let's not play Beat the Demo, where we come in and you've already done the bass tracks, you've already done the tracks, and then here, this is what I want you to sound, us together figuring out what we want to sound. Yeah, I think they're like most things, as you put it really well. There's some good in it, and there's some bad at it, and it's of a different era, isn't it?
different time, and I guess my book is a love letter for
Yeah.
that time.
It,
I
yeah.
want to make
Well
sure
said.
that I want to make sure that people knew its significance, its importance, and I want to make sure that it was preserved. Although physically not preserved, the stories were preserved. And
Mhm.
just like you're preserving the stories of Bruce's fans, I want to preserve the stories of those people who made those great classic records of the '70s.
Buzz me in the Record Plant Studios, inside the Record Plant Studios, Martin Porter, quote unquote, the real Hotel California. My friend, this was a joy. Thank you. I thank you for letting me nerd out, ask some, I hopefully entertaining questions. Let's do it again sometime, okay?
Jesse, it was a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
All right, listeners, check out the book. Go to the Facebook page, follow it. Be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.